welcome everybody to the Budget Engagement Forum today. I've just got a very brief announcement and introduction to make, and then some Zoom etiquette rules to spell out as well. And then I will hand over to Councillor Samuel and his officers team to go through the budget in more detail. And then we'll allow a Q&A session at the end for anybody who wishes to ask questions of Richard or his team. So, by law, we must balance our budget, and every year we publicly set up our spending plans out. So our 2021-22 budget investment to improve people's lives in such a way which tackles the climate and ecology emergency, improves local transport, and helps the local economy recover. However, the council faces a significant budget challenges for 22-23 due to the ongoing impact of the pandemic. An increase in demand for our services, such as adult social care and children's services, recruitment and supply chain issues, together with inflationary pressures. During tonight's discussion, we'll be setting out our financial position, the ongoing financial pressures we face, and how we respond to those challenges with our limited resources. Just to spell out the Zoom etiquette for everybody, please keep your microphones muted when not speaking. There will be a chance at the end, as I've already stated, to ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. This session will be recorded and currently has been recorded and placed on the council's YouTube channel. People can view later, and will also have the opportunity for others to view the video later on. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to the Cabinet Member for Finance and Resources, Councillor Richard Samuel.
Right, well, good evening, everyone. As Kevin says, I'm Councillor Richard Samuel, Councillor for Walcott, and I'm the Cabinet Member for Economic Development and Resources. And this is the third budget that I've helped the council put together. And quite like the last two, it's been a very challenging process. What we're going to do is to kick off by showing a video that we showed last year, actually, to the engagement session, which I think will kind of give you quite good context. Because what's interesting when you see it is how little things have changed in the last 12 months in terms of the challenges we face. It must be also pretty obvious to everybody that Omicron is the latest challenge. And so the environment we're operating in is still very difficult because of the pressures the ongoing pandemic is creating. So, Mark, if we could roll the video first, and then we'll take it from there.
Every year, we publicly set out our spending plans. By law, we have to balance our budget. This year, we set a net budget of £118 million. We invested in services to improve people's lives, from tackling the climate emergency to building state-of-the-art education facilities for our young people, preparing for the future, delivering for residents, and focusing on prevention. And we put £4 million into our reserves. Then COVID-19 struck. It hit our finances hard. Our income shrank overnight. We needed to spend more on things like PPE and protecting our vulnerable residents. At one stage, we were losing more than £91,000 a day in heritage and parking income that we needed to run our services. But we took action quickly, brought our finances back on track, and succeeded in balancing the books. We must now draw up our spending plans for next year. Our financial outlook is very different to 12 months ago. The pandemic is still with us. It continues to have a big impact on our income, and we cannot rely on further government support. We have to save money. We have to live within our means. We have to respond to an increased demand for our services. We have to think differently. For our budget to balance for next year, we need to make savings. Doing things differently saves us money. We're reducing our management spend. We'll save on borrowing costs. We'll lock in savings we've made in year, saving us around £4 million. But we must also make room for investing to improve people's lives and deliver the priorities we agreed in our corporate strategy. Delivering for residents, livable neighbourhoods will create better, greener spaces and fairer access for all. Preparing for the future. We're investing to renew our high streets, focusing on prevention. We work with partners to help the most vulnerable through our community wellbeing hub. Above all, we'll make sure everything we do tackles the climate and ecological emergency, and we will establish a renewable energy investment fund. In challenging times, we need to make sure every penny is aimed at improving people's lives. Now you've heard how we plan to manage our finances. We'll now be drawing up our budget proposals, setting out our detailed spending plans for the year ahead. In January, they'll be scrutinised by councillors and be considered by Cabinet in February. Before our budget and council tax meeting on Tuesday the 23rd of February, all the info will be online, with meetings live streamed on our YouTube channel. We've pledged to give people a bigger say. You can email us at budget@bathness.gov.uk. For the latest, follow us on social media. Sign up to our weekly e-newsletter. So please have your say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. The reason we played that is that it's surprising how little has changed in the last 12 months. Some of the dates, some of the numbers are slightly different, but the financial environment in which we're operating in is still very hostile. And the big difference between the year coming and the year we're in at the moment is that over the last 12 months and before that, in the year before, there has been a lot of central government support to help councils. That has more or less dropped away now, and we're on our own, really. So I think there's kind of quite a big difference. But I wanted to show that little clip to kind of explain the context before we go on to the next bit. So I've got a couple of slides to do to set that out. So if we could, Andy, if we could put up the first one and the next one, I think it is. Lovely, thank you. So the starting point when you're doing any of these budgets is the year before and what changes from year to year. The big changes from last year, and they were an issue from the year before, thank you, Andy, are the impacts from COVID. And what that 15.3 million figure relates to, easily explained, is it is the dramatic drop in income which we receive from our heritage offers, such as the pump rooms, the Roman baths, car parking income, and the commercial estate, the council's property estate, all of which have seen big drops in income. And the accumulative effect of that is to remove £15 million of spending power from the council's budget preparation. Every year has new demands and new things that happen that have to be dealt with. And this year is the coming year is no exception. And all of you will probably know that we are seeing quite strong inflation in the economy at the moment, which is worse in some sectors than others. And that, of course, council has to deal with that like any other organisation. So there are inflationary pressures and things that just have to be done, and that's built into our figures. So this is the year we're in, 2021, and what we had to do there as well to balance books, we had to make a big saving. And those figures take you down to the starting point, which we'll come on to in a minute, which is the budget for the year that we're coming into. And I just want to make the final point on that slide that whatever the net budget turns out to be, it can only be met by council tax, the income we raise from business rates, and any external grants. If you spend over the net budget figure, you have to take that figure from your reserves. And of course, you can only do that once. So it's not really an option for planning a council spending long term. So if we go to the next slide, please, Andy. Now this is a very interesting slide because it shows you why we as a council have particular problems to address in financial terms. What this chart is, the bar chart, it shows all the unitary and upper tier authorities, county councils in the UK, and it shows you the spending power they have per resident, per head. At the far end, and we are fifth from the bottom, we have the fifth lowest spending power, and Camden is the fifth highest, is 5 million. So they're kind of roughly comparable. Well, what that means in cash terms is if we had the spending power given to us through grants and other ways that Camden have, this council would have £77.5 million extra funding that we don't have to spend on services. Now, Camden may seem a different world away from, the West Country, but if we now overlay the figures for our immediate neighbours, you will see the problem is exactly the same, although to a different extent. So, for example, Bristol, if we had the same spending level as Bristol, we would have 26 million extra budget to spend. And that makes a dramatic difference to what we can do on a day-to-day basis. And even at the lower end of that, South Gloucestershire is there, slightly above us. That's still 6.3 million more spending power than we have. So these are quite important figures to get across, because they show that if there's any levelling up needed, it's actually to make settlements for local government fair across the board. So I think at that point, I'm now going to hand over to you, Will, to delve into the detail a bit more.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about where we are in this financial year, and then a bit of context on the challenge for next year. So we monitor the budget performance on a quarterly basis, and what you will see here is that at the end of the quarter two, which is at the end of September, our forecast is that we will hit our budget for 21-22. There are a number of items that make up that, so just so people are aware of this. So our parking income has recovered to a greater extent than we thought when we set the budget, and we're projecting to receive around £3 million more parking income than we'd originally anticipated. Now that offsets a pressure that we've got, particularly in children's social care. So one of the things we've seen as a result of the pandemic is a greater level of demand, particularly around children's social care, and that has increased our costs by about £2 million. Conversely, adult social care is under budget by around 1.4 million. Part of that is to do with the fact that essentially more money has gone into the social care system generally, both through the NHS route, and also government putting more money into social care generally. So that just shows that actually our case level has been pretty stable, and with that additional money coming in, etc., that means that we're slightly under budget. And then one of our other main sources of income is around our heritage estate, principally income generated through the Roman baths, and you'll see there that our income is actually projected to be down by around 1.5 million. So when you take those major variances into account, as I say, we are at the moment projecting that we will be balancing the budget by the end of this financial year, March 2022. Next slide, Andy, please. So then as we come on to 22-23, which is what we're kicking off tonight, again, just to make sure that there's context within the parameters that we have to work within. So legally, the council has to set a balanced budget, and excuse me, as officers, we have to essentially sign off the budget proposals that are going to cabinet and to council to make sure that actually we think that those proposals are robust, and also that the council has adequate reserves to manage any unforeseen circumstances. And clearly, in the current circumstances, that's even more relevant than maybe it has been previously. Go on to the next slide. This just gives a little bit of context, and in a minute I'm going to hand over to Andy, who's going to go through these figures in a bit more detail. But as Richard said, our starting point, so this year's budget is £130 million. We think that basically with the additional pressures, etc., which again Andy will unpack in a minute, that means there's an additional pressure on the budget of around 16.6 million. We've identified savings, and we think there's potentially more income that could be generated, which brings it down to about 12.3 million. So the proposed net budget for next year that will at the moment is planned to go through cabinet and council, etc., is in the region of 134 million pounds. So I'm going to hand over to Andy Rothery now, who's going to take you through that in a bit more detail. Andy.
Okay, thanks, Will. So I'm going to talk through the numbers in a bit more detail, starting with the funding requirement, which is the 16.6 million that was added to the 130 million start position. So I've simplified this and broken the numbers down into 4 categories. The first one, financing changes. So every year we have changes in kind of corporate financing. Some of this is down to grants dropping out. Last year, as Richard said at the start, we had a high degree of COVID grants. Some of those drop out in 22-23. And also we need to put in financing for interest costs and other corporate financing requirements that fund areas such as our capital programme. Also, we've got running costs that need to be funded, pay inflation, contract inflation, and also demand-driven services such as adult social care and children's social care, where numbers go up. We profile our budgets against a prediction on future demand. That's 7.3 million. Also, what we're recognising at the moment is some significant risks around workforce and also above normal contract inflation. So it's prudent to put in a 2 million contingency for risks where areas may come out of contracts next year and they cost significantly more because of increases in the retail price index and also consumer price index. And also we've been doing a thorough review of all of our budgets, in-year performance, and identifying where there are pressures and where we need to take an approach to rebase some of those pressures to make sure they're recognised, so we have robust estimates going into next year. And that's come up with a new funding requirement of 4.7 million. So taking those figures down in a bit more detail, at a portfolio level, that's a combination of funding pressures, but also new investment of 4.3 million into children's and adult services. In the main, this is covering additional funding for care placements, funding contract costs, and also putting in additional funding into education services. Across climate emergency and neighbourhood services, we're putting in 1.2 million of additional funding. This is putting money into recycling, investing in salaries because demand's going up, there's more recycling, we need to invest in the workforce also, and we're resourcing to meet demand. Other areas, not quite as high in terms of the quantum, but there's still significant investment is being put into digital resilience and hybrid working across the council. The way we're working now is very different to how we were working 24 months ago. And in terms of future-proofing the council, money needs to be put into our IT infrastructure. Also, we're putting funding into managing the climate emergency, improving our customer services, and also identifying and addressing gaps in the workforce. To fund some of that investment, we do need to make savings. I've broken down the 12.3 million savings requirement that's in the budget proposal by income generation and also savings plans. The slide shows some of the key areas where there's significant figures that are contributing towards the 12.3 million. The first one's a kind of a corporate saving. It's looking at how we project our capital expenditure, our outgoings, where we need to take out borrowing, and looking at our borrowing requirements. We projected by looking at the delivery profile of the capital programme that we want to make sure we don't borrow money in advance of need and incur interest costs that we need to fund from our revenue budget. So with a revised profile, we've identified that we can make a 2 million saving to our revenue budget by not borrowing in advance. We've also been looking at our commercial estate income profile. That's been heavily rebased in the 21-22 budget, taking into account the COVID impact. However, we've got a strategy to start looking at diversifying income on our commercial estate, and also with new lettings, we feel a further 1 million can be generated that will contribute towards our service pressures. Also, we're looking at vacancy management corporately across the whole workforce. So every service does have a period of vacancies when the staffing turnover, and by building a vacancy factor into our budgets, 1.3 million can be achieved as a saving. And also the key areas across children's services where we're looking at investing in services that can generate savings. So as an example, investing into foster care will help generate a saving by preventing higher cost escalations into high cost placements such as residential care and children's services. This slide gives the 5-year budget view. We've talked a lot about the gap and how that will be managed in 22-23, which you can see at the start position of the slide. The orange sort of red figure illustration is where our funding increases, and the blue is the budget gap. As we go through the 5-year period, you'll see that there's a decrease in funding, but we come back into balance in 25-26, and the gap in between funding and our outgoings, the growth requirements, does start to reduce. This is really positive because over the future years, we're also repaying any one-off use of funding to help transition the council out of the COVID period where we've had material losses of income. That one-off money is fully repaid by 25-26, and we come back into a positive funding balance. To finish off the presentation, I wanted to just cover some of the key dates. Throughout January, we've got the core content of the budget going to the policy development and scrutiny panels. And then after scrutiny, they'll be worked up with the full budget reports going to the 10th cabinet meeting in February, and then the 15th in full council for the consideration of the full budget proposal. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I think we're over to Q&A.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Richard. As I put in the chat, guys, please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your emoji symbol sign or put your hand up. What I'll do is I'll start with the questions in the chat, if that's okay with everybody. Right, the first question I've got from Alison Bourne is, why is our council tax and grant income so low compared with other authorities?
Shall I take that? Actually, from the questions, Kevin, in the chat so far, the only one that I think is beyond my pay grade is the one around business rates and empty properties, which I'm going to ask Andy to do, but I think I know the answers to most of them. So the issue about the funds available to council is historic. In years gone by, and it probably we're going back a decade now, every council used to get what was called a revenue support grant, a grant from central government, which was not identified for any particular purpose, and which effectively bridged the gap between spending and income. And the grant was built up of a whole series of indicators. So, for example, if your council represented a very deprived community, you got higher levels of grants to reflect that. And unfortunately for Bus North East Somerset, we are pretty well near the bottom of the most deprived authorities list, although we do have areas of deprivation. And so historically, we always had less grants. In the last decade, the government has moved away from a general grant and tended to give earmarked pieces of money for particular things. And really what that has led to, which was the purpose of putting a slide up, was to show that there are now huge distortions in the money available to local councils. And unfortunately, what's called a fair funding review, which is a piece of work that's been underway for at least 5 years now, the government has failed to bring forward proposals to restructure local government finance to make it fair. Recently, the Chancellor said that there were no plans to bring any proposals forward before the next general election. So we are stuck with the system, which is now historic, and that's why it doesn't deliver much grant to Bath North East Somerset. There was a question around Avon Street car park, and the answer to that's actually fairly straightforward. It is proposed to demolish Avon Street car park next year, and the land on which the car park currently sits, plus the land surrounding it, will be remediated, excuse me, and for a period of time there will be a surface car park. And that is until Legal and General bring forward the development of Bath Quays North. So those allowances for loss of income and return of some income are contained within the overall parking income figure. There may be some adjustments depending on the timing of the demolition, but the figures are contained within the parking estimate, income estimates for parking income for next year. The clean air zone, there was a question raised about that. Any money raised by the charges for the charges for the clean air zone are ring fenced to go back into either transport spending or to prepare for the day when the clean air zone meets its legal targets and the possibility comes of dismantling the clean air zone. Now, we're nowhere near that at the moment, but it costs quite a lot of money to set up the clean air zone, as you all probably appreciate, and it will cost quite a lot to decommission it. So some of that money will build up into that fund over time. I think there was also a question from Robin Kerr about electric vehicle charging. There is one simple problem that Bath in particular has to deal with. The power grid that serves Bath is inadequate to take a big expansion in electric vehicle charging. The organisation responsible for the power grid is Western Power Distribution, and they commit capital investment into the grid on a cyclical basis. And my understanding of the present position is that Western Power Distribution are looking at including an upgrade to the Bath grid in their next 5-year plan, which I think commences in 2023. But at the moment, it is completely impractical to expand on-street electric vehicle charging because the grid hasn't got the capacity to do it. So there's a problem there that has to be solved before the grid can take the extra charging. So I think that was the questions I saw so far. There was one around business rates and what happens to the treatment of vacant shops and loss of income. So I think you probably better placed to take that than me.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So that is definitely a risk on business rates collection. In terms of assessing that impact, our budget's not assuming significant growth in business rates. We did build in a decrease in terms of business rates collection. What we have seen in year, it's in terms of general performance, it's kind of stayed flat. But there are definitely risks. We have factored in kind of flat cash with a slight reduction in business rates collection over the financial planning period. But on the positive, what we are seeing is definitely an upturn in market interest in properties in Bath for the ones that we own in terms of our inquiries and also our active promotion in terms of attracting new lettings. So we do hope there will be an upside, but at the moment, it's definitely, we're not seeing material growth and some pressure.
Thank you, Andy. Did you want to talk directly about, there's two questions to do with our property portfolio and how we're filling them and its connection to the budget?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Is this the the one in reference to empty shops?
Yes.
Yeah, this is really critical for us in terms of our commercial estate strategy. We became aware early in this financial year and really planning for the 21-22 budget that we were seeing voids increasing on the Baines owned estate. To manage that, there's a few different approaches we're taking. In the first instance, we've been encouraging the use of pop-ups to make sure that any empty properties are being utilised in terms of interim use with tenants, and we've had a degree of success with that in terms of having 2 hubs in the city, a commercial hub that's being used on the weekend for lettings, and also a high street hub that's got mixed use of businesses. And also we're looking at options to invest in some of the Baines owned estates and diversify it. So we're looking at options to create residential use on upper floors and more diversified use on the ground floor. So you may see more conversions from retail to general retail to food and beverage or office, but it's really responding and being flexible to what the market wants. But in terms of the actual vacant units, like I said earlier, the positive is we are now seeing significant inquiries in terms of alternative use for some of our properties.
Thank you, Andy, for that answer. There is also a question from Nicolette Boter, reference considering community municipal investments. Is that something you'd like to answer as well, Andy?
To deal with that, let me give Andy a bit of a break for a minute.
Okay, well, thank you.
So it's true to say that a significant element of our budget is around social care, and it's also true to say that the way that local government funded doesn't give us that many options in terms of raising money, particularly around revenue. So the idea of community municipal investments is something that you could look at that in terms of issuing bonds, etc., around capital investment, and that would have a marginal impact probably on elements of our budget going forward, but it wouldn't significantly offset the cost of social care. So actually the most important thing for us is to think about how we do things more efficiently going forward, and ultimately, obviously, hopefully, the new model of social care that is being put forward in the white paper. Hopefully, over a period of time, what the government will do is they will, and they've said this, that the initial bulk of the money from the social care levy goes into the health service, and over a period of time, hopefully, actually, what will happen is more of that money will come back into local government. They've committed to do that, and that will then give us more money to actually fund social care going forward. So, we can look at things like bonds and mutual investments, etc., but that's probably more on our capital investment than on our ongoing revenue. Thank
you, Will. Appreciate that. As Graham's question, I think I can answer that one. So footfall is up 119% compared with pre-pandemic levels. So obviously the council bid and local businesses deserve a lot of credit there for encouraging people to come to the city. Obviously, if you're encouraging more people to come to the city, you want to improve the infrastructure for them to get to the city. So they both go hand in glove, to be honest. We've got a question about what is the percentage increase for domestic rates, and are they being factored in? Richard?
Well, there aren't any rates anymore. It's council tax these days. And there are 2 charges that are potentially applicable to all council taxpayers. There is a limit set on those by the government, and the limit for the next financial year is 1.99 maximum increase on council tax and 1% on social care precept. The council hasn't made any decisions yet as to what it should do. That's the purpose of this consultation and examination of the budget. But obviously, and each percentage of either council tax or social care precept raises around £1 million. So if you take away any increase, you're basically knocking off £1 million a time, and that would have to be found from somewhere else. But as I say, we're not at the stage yet where we are putting proposal forward. We won't be at that stage until January. The other thing members on the call need to think about is that currently inflation in the economy is running at over 3%. So any increase that the council makes really needs to have some reference across to the inflation rate in the economy. And like everybody, like every other large organisation, the council is vulnerable to those pressures. If fuel costs go up, we have to pay those. If wage rates go up in particular sectors, such as we've seen with HGV drivers, we have to pay those. So we are as vulnerable to inflationary pressures as anybody else. So that's something that we have to balance out when we think about should there be a council tax increase or social care increase. So that's the position we're in. We haven't made that decision yet.
Thank you, Richard. And there's two final questions in the chat before I go to people on the screen. There's one around how are we amplifying plans around renewable energy?
Well, this is quite complex because this relates to capital expenditure. There is potentially scope to increase the supply of renewable energy into the grid, either through solar energy or energy generated through wind. But obviously, where schemes are being highlighted, they are a major issue for consultation with the communities where those schemes potentially could be placed. So it would be fair to say that the initiatives Council is working on at the moment are not so dramatic as large-scale wind farms or solar farms or anything like that. And generally, these things will come forward from the private sector rather than the council itself. But the council's role is to make sure that the planning framework in which these schemes sit is fit for purpose. And that's part of the local plan partial update that is going through at the moment, which has been out to public consultation. So it's a bit difficult to answer the question in terms of, yes, we're doing this or that, because there are many factors at play. I don't know, Andy, if you want to add to that.
Can I just quickly add to that? So, Richard, I think the other thing that's important for people to recognise is the council can't just spend money on anything it might want to. You know, we have to. Our spend is limited by legal powers that are set out. So you have to have a legal power to support any spend that you want to do. So, for instance, things like, you know, subsidising businesses, all of that sort of stuff, which are, you know, good ideas and probably well intentioned, but the council can't just spend money on sorts of things that people might want us to spend money on if we haven't got a legal power that gives us the basis to do that. If we were to do that, you know, we would be, you know, the government and our auditors would basically stop us from spending money that we didn't have a power to spend on.
Thank you, Will. We've got one final question in the chat, which is from Sandy. How do you balance expenditure of Bath compared to the rest of North East Somerset, especially the rural areas?
Do you want me to take that, Kevin?
Please, Richard. Yeah.
Well, so the population of Bath North East Somerset is roughly split 50-50 between Bath City and North East Somerset. We generally aim as a kind of aspiration to make sure that spending across the whole of Bath North East Somerset is roughly equal where we can do that. And what we certainly don't want to do is to see lots and lots of money spent in Bath to the detriment of North East Somerset and vice versa. So it is easy to see an almost inexhaustible supply of things that could be done in Bath. A historic city, 200 to 250 years old, lots of things to fix, lots of things we're responsible for, and lots of pressure on the transport network. So we know that there's an inexhaustible things supply of things to do. But North East Somerset has to be prioritised. We have put an awful lot of money and time and investment into Keynsham recently, and Keynsham will be seeing increases in housing, which is why we're investing in the high streets there. Same in Midsummer Norton. And we are trying to make sure that schemes that go into North East Somerset are schemes that residents want to see and can be delivered, and that is going on. But I don't think you will ever see an exercise to say, well, we've reached our limit in Bath and now we've got to find things to do in North East Somerset. It has to be more nuanced than that. But I mean, the general approach is we want to see roughly equal levels of spending across all areas. And of course, the universal services that everybody receives, whether it's planning services or environmental services, council tax, benefit services, those go to all residents. The differences will generally be in capital schemes, where it's probably true that more capital schemes get spent in Bath rather than North East Somerset. And that's because of the nature of the district we have.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. One final question from Hilary before I move on to the hands up, which is, I believe it's been corrected. Has the funding balance projections for future 25-26 been based on there being on the ongoing epidemic? I think that's what you wanted to say, Hilary.
Yeah, I've got that one, Kevin. Shall I take it? Yeah, thanks, Hilary. So, yeah, in terms of bringing back into balance, there's two factors that come into play from kind of around the 2025 period. Our core assumption is that our income levels in the main on heritage services, so Roman baths and also
some of these enforcement issues that we have.
Thank you, Malcolm. Andy, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'll take the pay inflation bit first. Our annual assumption throughout the budget is 2% pay inflation over the 5-year period each year. I wasn't 100% clear on the enforcement question around the workforce.
If I come back in there, my secondary question really is that obviously your 2% or whatever the number is takes into account existing staff levels and inflationary increases. Are there any assumptions made about increasing in certain sectors the actual number of people involved so that some of our enforcement issues around Bath will have more personnel to manage them?
Yeah, we do. So when I break down the numbers in terms of doing that kind of annual budget rebase, if we see significant demand or new service requirement, and it's something that's being put forward and recommended, it's funded from core revenue, that'll incorporate the required staffing budget, and then that gets factored into the annual numbers once it's approved and agreed as a budget proposal that gets taken forwards. And also, I just want to note, we do have areas in terms of peaks of demand and different areas of work that we have to carry out, where sometimes we attract grant funding also that will pay for the workforce. So that's usually time limited around a specific piece of activity.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for that question, Malcolm. Thank you. Nicolette, welcome. I think you got your hand up.
Yes. I wanted to just explain a little bit more what was behind the question I asked about whether the council has considered community municipal investments. Listening to the introduction to this budget talk, as I have done in previous years as well, I'm struck by the mismatch between the council's underlying vision, or the driving vision, in which listening to citizens and addressing the climate and ecological emergencies are the driving objectives, and the sort of the detailed revenue dominated discussion which we then get into quite quickly. Now, as a citizens looking beyond the electoral cycle and looking very much at what's going to happen to our climate over the next decade, investing in infrastructure is absolutely sort of top of my mind. And I asked the question about the community municipal investments because here is a way of potentially of addressing both those two core parts of your vision, providing some of the infrastructure and allowing the communities to say how it's used. And I noticed in the answer to somebody else's question, you mentioned, well, the infrastructure for, I don't know, for solar panels or whatever it is, the private sector is going to do that. Yes, the private sector has a huge role to play in that too, but if you really want the inclusive, locally relevant infrastructure, you've got to find a way of making sure that the communities have their say in doing that. Community enterprises, like we have a brilliant energy community enterprise in this way, are part of the solution, but they're never going to do it at the sort of scale which something like a community investment bond is. So maybe it's beyond the scope of this discussion to get an answer on to my question now, but I certainly wanted to put it on the table as one which it would be good to know that the council was thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you,
much.
Nick. That's a very good question. Will, do you want to jump in there?
Just very quickly. So I think all those are very fair challenges. What I would say is that infrastructure investment isn't just limited to the council's funding. So the combined authority has got a significant role around infrastructure investment as well. And obviously we work at a regional level about infrastructure, particularly around transport, etc. So I think the challenge you put forward is a very good challenge, and like lots of these things, sometimes it's helpful for somebody to come along and challenge our thinking and think a bit differently about how we address some of these things. And I'm certainly not saying that your idea is something we shouldn't investigate. I think what we're trying to say is that there are different streams of funding, and what we're doing tonight is just presenting one of those streams of funding. We aren't really talking about the whole picture, particularly when it comes to infrastructure investment. So maybe that's a topic for another day that we can explore in a bit more detail in further conversations.
Thank you. I'm very happy to discuss it another day.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Nicolette, for your question. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I have been flicking through the screens, guys, and I can't see any more hands up or any more raised emoji hands. Can I just have confirmation from that from Mark or Dave? I haven't missed anybody there, have I? No,
it looks like there's a couple more comments in the chat, Kevin, but no more hands raised now.
Okay, right. Yep, so Eleanor's making the point about officers, and I'm sure that can be raised again through scrutiny, Eleanor, as well. Okay, thank you very much for that point. Right, okay, so just leaves me to say thank you, everybody. The people who've taken part, there will be an opportunity for you to obviously watch this again on YouTube, and we also would like your feedback on how this session has gone, and that link will be sent out to you by officers. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for the officers as well. Good night, everybody.